Everybody, thank you for joining us in this session. My name is Vítor Sudbrack. I'm a master candidate at the Institute for Theoretical Physics of the State University of São Paulo, IFT-Unesp. And today I'll talk about my work that I developed in the past 2 years, which is population dynamics in highly fragmented landscapes. So in this presentation, I will start with an introduction to the problem of fragmentation per se. Then we move to a mathematical model to study this problem. We will answer some qualitative questions. I will present some statistical model, statistical description, and we'll move to some quantitative results, and finally some final considerations. So in the ecological literature, we know that habitat loss is detrimental to the ecological value of landscapes, of portions of land. We have several studies that show this, measuring this ecological value of landscapes through several ecological metrics, such as species abundance, biodiversity. In fact, we can go even further and say that this relationship between the ecological response and the habitat loss is linear for large and medium portions of land, portions of habitat. And then as the habitat loss progresses, we have a region in which the ecological response starts decaying really fast. And this is known as the extinction threshold, where we lose the species. So we have a strong decrease of abundance and biodiversity in those landscapes. But if on one hand, we do have a lot of evidence to the effect of habitat loss, the effect of habitat fragmentation, which is a general concept for the distribution, the spatial distribution of the remaining habitat amount, is still very debatable. We can understand fragmentation, so a fragmented landscape, as a process that decreased the habitat amount, that increased the number of habitat regions, which we refer as patches. So it increases the number of patches, it decreases the size of these habitat portions, and it increases their isolation, their mean distance. Right, so all of this we can refer to as fragmentation. In these landscapes, as I bring as an example, you can see that these would be more fragmented than this first landscape, right? So because we already know the effect of habitat loss, we want to define fragmentation as the difference between spatial distributions for a fixed amount of habitat, right? Removing the effects of habitat loss. So this is usually referred to as fragmentation per se. So it's different habitat fragmentations for a fixed amount, for a fixed habitat amount. So here we represent the new problem that is now three-dimensional, right? So fragmentation is a new axis, a new dimension that we can control. And fragmentation per se, we represent as an perpendicular axis to habitat loss to infer this idea of orthogonality of these two effects. Of course, if we want to add this axis to the problem, we need to quantify it. So this can be achieved by applying fragmentation metrics. So the examples we saw before, as number of habitats, patch isolation, mean patch size, are all examples of fragmentation metrics, and there are actually several of them. So when we start understanding the ecological effects through these fragmentation metrics, we see that this is a very heated debate on the literature. So I bring as an example this study by Leonor Farig called Ecological Responses to Habitat Fragmentation per se, in which she reviewed the literature to try to find the empirical studies and their conclusions. So she found that the majority of studies did not find significant effects, significant ecological effects of fragmentation per se. But from those that find significant effects, most of them, approximately 3/4, found positive effects of fragmentation per se. Of course, this was something surprising somewhat. So she went to these studies that found these positive effects and tried to seek for their explanations. So actually the most common explanation is actually no explanation at all. But from those studies that try to give some explanation to positive effects of fragmentation per se, they argue that more fragmented landscapes have higher connectivity between the portions of habitat. Okay. This study was actually the beginning of a debate. So here I also bring to you 2 other papers that argue for different points. But if I could sum up, one of the main challenges of trying to seek for ecological effects of fragmentation per se from empirical data is that when the regions of study, because it's constrained to species and we want effects only of fragmentation, they have low variability in these regions of study in the fragmentation patterns. And this variability is highly correlated with habitat amount, which we know has a negative effect, right? So we need statistical tools to detach these 2 kinds of effects that act simultaneously. All of this discussion brought an editorial in the Conservation Biology magazine journal, in which they argue that this controversial question is at the core of conservation biology. So it's in fact a very important question. And they lay the idea that perhaps we shouldn't try to generalize the effects of fragmentation per se, but rather to seek what situations, what cases we have positive and negative effects. So we thought, how could we help this discussion from mathematical modeling, right? From synthetic data. So now I will present to you a mathematical model to try to study these kinds of effects. So our equations are reaction-diffusion equations, which is a large group of equations that take the form in which the rate of change in time is equal to a local function plus a spatial diffusion, right? So this first function is called the local reaction. It's a pointwise reaction, and it can be exponential growth, logistic growth, some death rate. Okay, I will give some examples in the next slide. And the second term accounts for a spatial diffusion. So this population diffusion is the equivalent to an individual level random walk. So it supposes that in the lack of heterogeneities, of spatial heterogeneities, animals, individuals move randomly. So we have 2 regions in our landscapes. One region we call as habitat. So in habitat, the local reaction is logistic growth. So species can grow in habitat and diffuse. Whereas in regions that are not habitat, and they are usually referred to as matrix in literature, just mean not habitat, species die because they don't have the resources and they diffuse. Okay? So these are the 2 regions of our binary landscapes. In reaction diffusion equations, we can always associate to the equations some characteristic length. So we can rescale the variables of time and the variables of space within this Laplacian to rescale variables and reduce the number of free parameters in the model. So we can always define some ratio of some length scale, which is the ratio of the diffusivity in those regions with a time scale given by the local reaction. So the local reaction in patches are logistic growth, and in the matrix is the death process. And when we rescale our variables, we actually find out that for the stationary regime, the only important parameter is their ratio. So we define the ratio as kappa, this new variable. And what we see is that kappa defines the hostility of the matrix, is a way to quantify the hostility or the quality of matrix. So for instance, when kappa is very small, which means that the characteristic length in the matrix is very high, means the matrix can be penetrated, right, for long distances. So in this case, we argue it represents a soft matrix, which allows inter-patch movement. So individuals can leave one patch, walk through the matrix, and arrive in another patch. Okay. Whereas when this parameter kappa is very high, it means that this characteristic length of penetration in matrix is very small, and hence it represents a hostile matrix. Animals cannot walk, cannot move, diffuse within the matrix. Okay. And what turns out is that this parameter kappa, which is the hostility of the matrix, is the only free parameter for the stationary solution of that set of equations on landscapes. Another important thing to add to this model is the interface conditions. So we need to relate the solution of the equations in haptet with the solution of these equations in matrix. So what we do is that we follow the work of Otto Ovaskein and Cornell that was afterwards revisited by Gabriel Maciel and Lucher, which they propose that this discontinuity should be proportional to the ratio between the diffusivities. All of these dynamics is applied upon artificial generated landscapes. So these landscapes are binary, so they have either haptet or matrix. We adapted a model proposed by Tischendorf and Fahrig in 2000. And the special thing about this model is that we can easily control for haptet amount. So the proportion of green in these landscapes as a fraction of the whole landscape. So in this study, we went from 5% of haptet amount to 90% of haptet amount. And we can also control for the degree of fragmentation. So in this first column, you have highly fragmented landscapes. And on the left column, have slightly fragmented landscapes. So the first thing we can do is to look for the total species abundance on these landscapes as a function of the only free parameter of the model. So that's what I present here, okay? So the top row is the average population density on landscape, and the bottom row is the average population density on haptet patches, on haptet regions. I performed this analysis for several haptet amounts. So here I have a few examples. And the red curve is this average taken over slightly fragmented landscapes, while the blue curve is the same average, but taken over highly fragmented landscapes. And they're all as a function of the only free parameter of the model, which is the matrix hostility. So what we can observe is that we have this inversion on the positions of the lines, right? So when the matrix is soft, so species can easily penetrate the matrix, it's actually good to be highly fragmented, because highly fragmented landscapes had bigger abundances, which is this top. The blue curve is over the red curve. But as we increase the hostility of the matrix, we actually see a reversion in the order of the lines, representing that when we're talking about hostile matrices, then it's bad to be fragmented. It's better to be slightly fragmented. So the red curve means that the species abundance on average is bigger, is greater in slightly fragmented landscapes than highly fragmented landscapes. Okay. And we observe this inversion at all habitat coverages, except for the very small one, which is 5%. In this case, the highly fragmented landscape cannot, the population cannot settle on highly fragmented landscapes because they have a very small habitat amount, and this is very dispersed. We can actually see the solutions. So here we have the plot of the spatial distributions in the stationary regime. Here, yellow or lighter colors represent higher occupations, higher densities. So we have two landscapes as an example. So slightly fragmented landscape and highly fragmented landscape. You can see that for a soft matrix, we have lots of interpatch movement. So the matrix is actually highly occupied. And in this case, the highly fragmented landscape has lighter colors in general, right? So it supports a greater population. And as we start increasing the matrix hostility, then the highly fragmented landscape presents something close to extinction of species, so black regions, while the big portions of contiguous habitat, which refer as patches, can still be a place to the population to settle, right? So population can settle here. So we have this inversion. So with this, up to this point, what I can conclude is that the effects of fragmentation should be dependent on this free parameter of the model, the matrix hostility, right? So from now on, the analysis I will present will consider three qualitative cases of soft, intermediate, and hostile matrices. Okay. So here we can see that the population is settled in the core area of these habitat patches, right? The yellow part is the core area of the habitat. So to test this hypothesis, I can plot this red curve, which is the average population density on landscape as a function of the habitat amount, okay, in a very hostile matrix, that previous figure. And the dashed lines here represent two possible explanations. So the gray line is a line that is proportional to habitat amount, right? So it's just the diagonal. And the black line is the habitat amount subtract the edge, the perimeter. And we have an expression of the edge density, the average edge density, as a function of the habitat amount, okay? And I should point out that the black curve has a free parameter, which is the conversion between perimeter, between area, and the ecological effect, okay? Which is this C here. So we can see that when we add the effects of edge density, we can actually explain much better the occupation level in the slightly fragmented landscapes in hostile matrices. Okay. So now we want to start quantifying this fragmentation, right? Not only in highly or slightly, but in a continuous way. So we start working with fragmentation metrics. So there are lots and lots of fragmentation metrics. Here, I will present only the ones I consider because I started removing the ones that were redundant There are a lot of redundancy between fragmentation metrics. So I also present some sort of classification of fragmentation metrics, which was actually proposed by one of the most common softwares to calculate these fragmentation metrics, which is called fragstat. So one metric to quantify the aggregation between APTAT patches is called the number of patches, or the order of magnitude of the number of patches. We use some area and edge matrix, such as mean area per patch and edge density. Some metrics of percentage of core area, so the percentage of APTAT that is far away from the matrix. And some metrics related to the shape of these patches, such as perimeter area ratio and the mean circumscribed radius between patches, and some deformation from an optimal shape that minimizes the perimeter area ratio. Okay. So one important point is that when we think of fragmentation intuitively, not always they represent increasing functions of their metrics. Okay. So when we go from this slightly fragmented landscape to this highly fragmented landscape, we are increasing the number of patches, the edge density, the perimeter area ratio, and the mean radii of patches, but we are decreasing the mean area per patch, the core area index, and the guy rate. Okay, so because to keep this in mind, I'm putting some asterisk, some star after the name. So this just represents that these metrics are actually decreasing as we increase fragmentation. Okay. So now we proceed to a statistical description, so a statistical model to connect geographical information, so APTAT amount and fragmentation metrics, with ecological information, which is the synthetic data that we produced with our mathematical model. Okay. Because these abundances are between 0 and 1, they are percentages of the occupation of the matrix, we opted to use as a linking function between these two kinds of informations, the logit function, which is the canonical function for Bernoulli distribution. So the first model that we present, I'll go from the simplest to the more complex one. So the first model, we say that the ecological information only depends on the APTAT amount on those landscapes. Okay, so we make a linear model of the ecological response as a function of the APTAT amount. So the second model is independent effects of APTAT amount and APTAT fragmentation. So it's the first model in this line, and we added a term to account for the fragmentation metrics. So actually this model 2 is 7, because for each fragmentation metric, we have a different model. Okay, we change this F here. And then finally, the last model in this section, which is model 3, it has interdependent effects of fragmentation and APTAT amount. So again, we have the first model, just the linear effect of APTAT amount. And then we have an effect of fragmentation that can increase or decrease across the APTAT amount gradient. Okay. And here I should point out that from the mathematical model, we cannot differentiate between an increase or decrease in the effects of fragmentation across the gradient of APTAT amount from an increase or decrease in the effects of the APTAT amount across the fragmentation gradient. Okay, so this interpretation that we are giving to model 3 is actually due to the ecological literature that stresses that APTAT amount is the #1 factor driving the ecological response in landscapes. So fragmentation is a secondary effect. So that's why we arrange this term in such a way. Okay. And all these coefficients, A0, A1, 2, and 3, they are all adjusted following the maximum likelihood estimator, which is, in few words, it's a way to maximize the probability of observing the data that we indeed observed. Okay. So now we can proceed analyzing the direction and the magnitude of the effects of habitat loss and fragmentation inside the models we presented. So just to keep in mind, I have all the models in the top left corner here. And the first thing we see is that all models have negative effects of habitat loss. So landscapes with more habitat amount have greater ecological value, okay? And we can conclude that because the coefficients A1, which is the linear coefficient between habitat amount inside these models, they are all positive when I'm considering soft, intermediate, or hostile matrix, okay? And other important thing is that we can see they are close to 9 here. They are close to also 9 here. So they're in the order of magnitude of units. This would be also important, okay? And surprisingly for the hostile matrix, we have a high variability in the coefficients, which we do not observe in soft and intermediate matrix. So as an example, we can see the model number 1, which is the simplest one, so it's easier to plot. So here I present the curves. So each point is a synthetic data, okay? So each black point is a synthetic data. And the blue curves are the model that best, that maximizes the likelihood of observing this synthetic data, okay? And we can see the monotonically increasing functions, right? So when we increase habitat, in average, we have higher ecological values. So now we proceed to the effects of habitat fragmentation, right? So, well, the first thing is that model 1 doesn't have any effect of habitat fragmentation, so we cannot analyze it. But we can analyze models 2 and model 3 for different fragmentation metrics. So we can see that in soft matrices, the coefficients are positive, right? So this one's positive, positive, positive. And the ones with the asterisk, remember these ones are decreasing metrics of increasing fragmentation. They are negative. So we can conclude that across all models, we have positive effects of fragmentation, right? According to every metric that we tested. And when we see model 3, well, in model 3, these effects, they can vary linearly across the habitat amount gradient, right? So it's this expression here in brackets. So here we see that as we go from greater to smaller habitat amounts, we can see decreases the strength of these effects. We'll explore this more later. For intermediate matrix, we have slightly bad effects. So you can see these effects are close to 0 here. 0 is the dashed line. And when we let these, the magnitude of these effects vary across the gradient amount, across the gradient of habitat amount, we see an inversion. So we see positive effects for high habitat amounts and bad effects for small habitat amounts. Whereas when we're talking about hostile matrices, we see a bad effect of fragmentation. So it's just confirming the results we had previously. One important thing that the quantitative analysis can provide us is that the order of magnitude of the coefficients are the same as the coefficients for opted amount. So actually, fragmentation is not negligible in this model, within this model. So now let's try to understand better. No, before that, let's apply some model selection criteria to try to find which fragmentation metric better describes the data, because we're using 7 of them, right? And they measure different aspects of fragmentation. So we employed several criteria. So relative log likelihood, ICAIC information criteria, model variance, which are traditional criteria to these kinds of tests. And especially because we have, it's synthetic data. So we have a great number of points of observations. They all agree to their selection. So the best model to describe the data we obtained is using the order of magnitude of the number of patches with interdependent effects with opted amount in soft matrices and intermediate matrices. And then when talking about hostile matrices, the best fragmentation metric to describe the synthetic data was edge density interdependent of opted amount. Okay. So in general, the interdependent models are the best explanations to the data we obtain. Okay. So to try to understand a little bit better the inversion of effects of fragmentation across the opted amount gradient, we proposed a new model, a fourth model. So before we had this interdependent effect model, model 3, that had a linear constraint on the coefficient of the importance of fragmentation metrics across the gradient of opted, right? So now what I call model 4, we actually remove this constraint and we try to give a linear explanation between ecological effects and fragmentation metrics within each group of constant opted amount, okay? So in each group of 100 landscapes for a fixed opted amount, we make a linear regression. So what we observe is that there are actually 2 nonlinear patterns of the effects of fragmentation per se across the opted amount gradient. The first one is a parabolic pattern. So here I present model 4 as the red, the black curve, the black points. And the model 3, which is constrained to be linear, is the red points. So here we can see a parabolic effect in which the effects are stronger at extreme values of opted amount. This actually could be explained in the case of edge density because it's symmetric with respect to the edge between opted and matrix and opted. Actually, this fragmentation matrix peaks at mid values of opted amount. So landscapes with 50% of opted amount on average have greater edge densities. But this couldn't be the explanation to the order of magnitude of the number of patches, because this metric is an increasing metric. It's actually a decreasing metric with the opted amount. So it couldn't be the explanation for this pattern here, for instance. And the second pattern we observed is that effects are only significant at low opted amounts. So here again, for instance, we have the unconstrained effects in black and the constrained effects to a linear relation in red. And here it's clear that the inversion we observed in intermediate matrices is actually an artifact of the model trying to capture this effect of non-significant for great amounts of output and significant for low amounts of output, right? Well, so this was the main points of this work, the main conclusions I presented. So recapturing the model that we presented here had emerging effects of both output loss and output fragmentation. So it can be a useful tool to understand the interplay between these two effects to the ecological response on landscapes. This model could explain the divergent results in empirical studies if we consider that different species and different locations perceive the matrix differently, right? So the direction of the effect of output amount, the direction of the effect of output fragmentation, either fragmentation or fragmentation per se, are dependent on the matrix hostility. And then finally, what this model, this theoretical model suggests is to consider quantifying matrix hostility in the statistical studies of empirical data. So to end my seminar, I would like to make some acknowledgements to UFABC, which helped this work financially, to my university and my institute in Brazil, in São Paulo. And also part of this work was done in Palma de Mallorca during a BEPI from UFABC at the Institute for Interdisciplinary Physics and Complex Systems in Mallorca, Spain. And especially to these people in this picture. And actually, because of the pandemics, we couldn't have better, more recent pictures, but I really like this one. And these are amazing people I had the pleasure to have with me during this semester. So thank you very much for your attention. And